This is Think of Be Eaten. We have back with us, everybody I have on is back with us because of the hiatus. We have Andy Colvin with us. There's quite a bit of stuff that's gone down since the last time we spoke. And we've usually done things according to the calendar. That was kind of turned out to be somewhat of a signature for us. And I think we're going to pick up with that, and whatever spurs off will spur off. And so, it's been a long time, but Andrew, it's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's great to be here. What all's been shaken there?
What besides becoming more reclusive and combative and
yeah.
Actually, it's nice. It's quiet. This is the way it should be. Life goes on. People get under this stuff and blah blah blah. But the way it is now is the way it's going to be. It's what I want. I don't care what anybody else wants, to be quite frank. And that's okay. I'm tired of being Ed Sullivan and a variety show and all this other stuff. I did it to myself, I admit. But it's not going to happen anymore. And I mean, if I have a close circle of friends or acquaintances or interview guests or whatever, that's okay. Because there's so much crap out there. It is just, it's unbelievable. But I want to cast a pall on this because this was always, I guess I want to say one of the more fun things. And I don't mean to belittle what we do, because there's an awful lot in there that's very important. It's just like the stuff that, I would do with Adam Go Rightly. So, but I don't know. This always seemed like it was a little bit of an oasis. And I don't say that, like I said, pejoratively. I think that's a credit to you. And so I'm just glad you're here. That's it. So.
Well, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I'm not throwing bull. That's how I feel. So let's get on with it. And Ian Bennett's out there. Ian, you once wrote me and you sent something in an email, and you kind of coined what it is that Andrew and I do, and it was perfect. If you could ever find that email, send it along again, because that was just priceless, and I've lost that when I evacuated the email address. So, all right, we're going to pick up with the calendar, and last we talked was probably about February.
Well, I want to reiterate before I get into February, I want to reiterate sort of my overall theory, I think, which is that as studies have shown, stress causes psychic phenomena. And it's my opinion that stress is being applied, manufactured and applied to the population.
Yeah.
And this explains why you can have a very scientific society and a very occultic society at the same time, because the more you break down a topic into separate pieces, the more different interpretations you can apply to each item, and you can apply confusing and multiple characteristics to any item, and this causes stress as well. So, because the mind then has to calculate a more complex matrix, and so this is why you'll see multiple conflicting stories in the media. Mm-hmm. Or this is why they don't mind that happens. That does happen just because it's such a huge system. But it works because it continues to add stress, which the elites have a reason for that stress. Mainly just to keep us off of any kind of political activity that might undermine what they're doing, just keep everybody busy working and surviving. But it also has this, unforeseen, for the most part, I guess, whatever outgrowth that people then have a lot more occultic and psychic things happening. And so, I guess my approach is to look at that side of it and then come back to the conspiracy side of it, rather than starting with a conspiracy, you can start at the other, at the other part of the loop, where you have the paranormal stuff happening.
But that is part of the conspiracy. I mean, that is the whole idea. That's like in the textbook for them. And just what you said, I mean, if you look at the 20th century onward, I guess you could call it a very heavily mechanized century, more so than any of them before, and of course, giving rise to what we have today. And I mean, you take a look, especially, let's look at the last time, I mean, with what was going on in Germany when Hitler was reigning. And, I mean, Hitler, I mean, did you ever hear that story about what they found when they went into the bunker in Berlin? There were like how many Buddhist monks that had committed suicide? And he had them there just for their mojo. Did you ever encounter that story?
Well, you've mentioned it a couple of times, but I haven't.
Why do you keep doing that to me? I keep feeling like I'm an Alzheimer's victim. Yeah, you mentioned that about 7 times. All right, Okay, but anyway. But what it does also is, how else could you get people to turn virulent and take patriotism, which I've come to think is abhorrent also, and turn it into nationalism, unless you freak them out and stress them out so much that they get on their knees, they outstretch their hands in supplication and ask the state to take care of them. Well, the state will take care of you, kids, but the thing is, you better not rebel, and we'll feed you and clothe you. And Andy, you've seen it happen here in the United States. Whatever Nazism was called before the Nazis, it's always been with us. But now that element has invested this country and will put us on the same road as 1940s Germany. And, and here we go. So with all the intended things that you just mentioned as well, namely occult/psychic activity, here you go. So.
Well, let me before I do this calendar, let me jump into another thing you and I talked about before we came on when now that you mentioned Hitler and everything. We were talking earlier about the tribe of Ishmael. This is a tribe that basically founded Indianapolis. They were blacks. They were intermingled with Indians, no one knows when they got started. But they definitely were coming from the Point Pleasant, southeastern Ohio area, from whence all the Mothman stuff has occurred. And, I've been speculating for a long time that they were the ones interacting with the mounds to create mojo from the mounds, putting dead bodies in there and so forth. And
But just as a refresher, Andy, and I'm sorry, I mean, and I can say, for my feeble brain, but from when we last left off with people who may not have access to some of those shows that address this, you pretty much feel that there's enough evidence there that there might have been some kind of Moorish habitation in that Ohio River area, right? West Virginia, Ohio.
Yeah, the huts that they lived on the East Coast, like Jamestown, all the way up to, New York and so forth. The huts were African style huts. The Montauk Indians were actually black and have names, Egyptian names, but they were classified as an Indian tribe in order to, just to discount them. Because once they said, well, you're not black, you're an Indian tribe. And then after a while they said, you're not even an Indian tribe because there's not enough of you. So they've been totally shut out of the whole, all the events up there with who owns what around Montauk. But they're definitely black. And, it seems like, because of their seafaring capabilities, they probably would have been over here alongside, Leif Erikson or the Chinese who supposedly came to the West Coast. These people got around, and there weren't a huge amount of people here, but there were a lot. There were thousands of people. And I think it's very plausible that that there were a lot of blacks here before slavery began. Uh-huh. And I think the slavery story actually is used because it's an unusual kind of thing for the elites to admit. The reason that they admit it is because they're covering up something
else
more damaging, which is that the blacks were here, owned land. And in fact, this comes up in the story of the founding of the Constitution, and there were lots of land claims by Huguenots and Moorish peoples, and all the prior presidents before Washington, all the interim presidents were black or part Huguenot. And I think the fact that they were mixing with the Indians, when people talk about the Iroquois Constitution and how that found its way into our Constitution, that's not, may not be excluding the Moors at all, because the Moors were intermingled with them. And if they were Islamic, which there's some indication that they were somewhat Islamic, that they probably weren't as matriarchically favorable as the Iroquois, because the Iroquois had a very strong, emphasis on female abilities. There's just a whole lot there. There's a whole huge database out there, odd writings that no one's really looked at. You kind of have to go to the bookshelves to find this stuff. It's mostly in older books. This thing that I'm talking about here was written by a guy named Leeming, and it's from what year is that? It doesn't have the year in there, but it's pretty old stuff. And he's got a map in here of this pilgrimage that the Ishmaelites took. They would leave southeastern Ohio every year and go all the way over to basically Champaign-Urbana, what is today Champaign-Urbana. There's a town right next to it called Mahomet, which is an Islamic name. Mm-hmm. And they would circumambulate something called the Holy Mountain of Harmonics. And it was a large area, and the northern part of it was Morocco, Indiana, which is a few miles up. And it was about a 350-mile, 400-mile trip, which they would do on foot every summer. And I just talked to somebody yesterday who said that there's a lot of mounds around Champaign-Urbana. And I haven't really located where the center of this holy mountain is. But one wonders, if it would be along the Wabash River, though. I think we can say that at least part of it. There's actually a town called Mecca there too on the Wabash. It's right above Terre Haute. And of course, I had some interesting synchronistic, I guess, events there, because I was dating someone who lived within that triangle in Crawfordsville, and it involved that car that burned up, the car that was once owned by Linda Blair, or Linda Blair's boyfriend. And and there was the Crawfordsville Sky Monster. There was actually a Birdman sighting within this triangle. This famous sighting. Anyway, Indianapolis was founded by these Ishmaelites, more or less. And as soon as it was about the same time that it was founded, Indiana became a state, and the KKK moved in. And I think the KKK and the Scottish Rite and all these guys moved in to Indiana because the Ishmaelites were there. That this was the place to go to fight the Muslims on their own turf. And so immediately after that, you saw, within I don't know, what year was Indiana founded? It must have been just like one generation. Suddenly you have the formation of the Scottish Rite and all the provocations toward the Civil War that we talked about, the Knights of the Golden Circle.
Also, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I had done some shows years ago with Stephen Schneider, who lives out in Indiana, and had done devoted some time when he was with me, and he was on several times, to the Magic Squares. Are you familiar with that in Indiana? And the way they laid out the counties?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I am familiar with it.
Okay. So, I mean, something definitely shaking there.
I think they went so far as to rename the river there that goes through Indianapolis to the White River. I think it was probably called the Black River before that or something. They've just changed it to cover up.
One quick side note, too, if you would, for whatever it means. Back at the beginning of the 19th century, probably for the first third to a half, down here in Florida especially, the Seminoles were under the gun. I mean, they actually had 7 wars with the federal government. Usually they only talk about 3. So the rest are technicalities, but the point is clear that they were a very recalcitrant tribe, good for them, and never signed a peace treaty, never, to this day, with the federal government. However, the Seminoles were very egalitarian, and whether they were runaway slaves or just whatever blacks, they would take them into their tribe. And the one stipulation they had, the Seminoles said that most blacks could not fight with them. That would not be allowed. I'm sure some had probably earned that right, but for the most part, they could not take the battlefield during the battle, but they could come on afterwards. And I don't have to probably explain or draw a picture for you as to the post-war savagery that took, or post-battle savagery that took place with regard to what they did to the bodies of U.S. soldiers. And it's interesting also because Osceola, who was never a chief but was actually renowned hitman and warlord, was half white. He was Scots Cree, and his name was Powell. So, I mean, here you have a tribe that's kind of directed for a critical part of their history by a racial warlord, but with a tribe that also embraced blacks and said, "Fine, you'll have all standing except you can't be a warrior." So,
well, around that same time in Indiana, they were doing the same thing to the Ishmaelites, and in 1907. I think probably as because this was, the front lines of the war against the blacks, the Indiana legislature came up with something called the Indiana Plan, which was basically a sterilization program.
There you go.
That they were going to force on the Ishmaelites. And
also, Andy,
yeah.
There's a book I could not find in the library. It's a tragedy. I'm not sure, we got a donation, and I'm not sure that I saved that one. I can't even tell anymore. I didn't give it special treatment until something piqued my interest, and I went looking for it, and I don't know that I didn't find it again, and I don't know if anybody else included it in the collection. But that bit about sterilization goes right into the 20th century, which may not be a big aha for folks, but, I was aghast. I mean,
well, this was 1907 when they drafted it.
That's right.
And Germany immediately applied it, took it on. They said, "Hey, that's a good plan there," and they started using it over there.
That's right.
And it actually morphed into. There's actually a quote by Leeming, where he's saying it directly morphed into the Nazi genocide.
Yep. And
the book that his article appears in is called "Gone to Croatan." Origins of North American Dropout Culture. And
that's spelled Croatan?
Yeah, and the guy's name is Hugo P. Leeming, Leaming. So, well, that's that. What else have we got? Last time we talked, it was February 17th.
But who's counting?
Rove was that day it was announced that Karl Rove would be let off, that Obama wasn't going to go after him. And Cheney, too. And so that's what happened, we haven't seen anything. Rove, I was just listening to Tom Hartman the other day, and he was saying that Rove was involved in the theft of the 2004 election in Ohio. By the Republicans, and that the votes had actually been counted in Kentucky by a staffer, like a Bush campaign guy, and that the server that was used to count the votes
was crashed.
Was the same one on which Rove and some other Republican guys had their BlackBerry accounts, and that the hard drives were crushed after the election, so that there could be no way they could tell what happened with the counting of the votes. And it made me think of this northern Kentucky area that I've talked about before along the Ohio there, where gambling originated, gambling, system that was transferred to Vegas and Havana.
Well, did they do any riverboat stuff? I mean, was that where it first started? Because it wasn't on land.
Yeah, it was all riverboat stuff,
right.
and then, but I think that's probably where this stuff, So what you start to see, and this again is all Masonic, like heartland, right in there, where you saw Jack Ruby. There's a lady in Cincinnati I talked to who thinks that Jack Ruby's son is still there and is running several restaurants, and that his name's Jeff Ruby, but we don't know for sure.
Well, also, Indiana figured in the escape of John Wilkes Booth, because John Wilkes Booth took the identity of an English immigrant by the name of John Wilkes. And
right.
Wilkes and Booth knew each other, and I think we went over this, but real quick, Booth took Wilkes' name and made it out to San Francisco, and through the British consulate got a passport in John Wilkes' name. So Booth, in effect, became John Wilkes. And the real John Wilkes did die in Indiana. So, here again. And Booth knew him because when he was on his little tours as a thespian, he had stayed at Wilkes', that's the story they're giving people, he had stayed at Wilkes' home. So they knew one another, and that was convenient, obviously. So Indiana, once again. And also, remember something too, Andy, even later on, and I don't want to offend folks, but, I mean, when you take a look at the Grange, which was heavily invested in the Midwest, also is built on a Masonic platform with
what
degrees.
What is?
The Grange.
Grange?
Yeah.
Oh, the idea of the Grange?
No, I mean, when people belong to the Grange, it's like a bunch of farmers get together, right?
Yeah.
But when you take a look at their degreed status and some of their symbology,
yeah.
There you go.
Well, a couple things about the symbology. One is that in Indiana, on Jefferson Proving Ground, there's an emblem that you can see on the map from the satellites that I think it's either a Star of David or just a pentagram. But there's one almost identical to it in I think it's Area 51 that somebody recently sent me. So wherever they build these bases, which typically were built on old roads, old Indian roads like Route 50, they'll have find a lot of Masonic temples and army bases on these roads. Route 50 goes right under this area that the Ishmaelites used to hold, this holy place.
Well, how many U.S. highways do you think, and this predates and deliberately so, predates the interstate system? And of course, many of the interstates run along what were just the first U.S. highways, like you said, 50. But I mean, what do you think the percentage would be of the U.S. highways that were definitely patterned after Aboriginal people's trails?
I don't know. I haven't really looked into that.
Well, I mean, I'm going to assume, it's quite extensive. And I mean, it's the old story about like, why reinvent the road if you can find out, because they knew how to get from point A to B most exponentially. So expeditiously, rather.
Certainly pieces of it were, the pieces that could be walked, were the old tracks that were, became their first roads. And then when they built the interstates, they would often put them right next to or incorporate pieces of the prior pieces of the same road. So, the interstate would just go straight as much as possible. So it might go over a gorge or a river or something that other people would have to walk around.
Now, do you know that piece of trivia about the interstates and how they have to have a mile straight, quote, runway, like every 10 miles or so? Are you familiar with this?
For landing?
Yes.
Yeah.
The interstate system, and Harry is the one I have to credit with finding this out, and he was correct. But the interstate system was about the transfer of personnel, military personnel, and materiel in an expeditious fashion.
There were some runways, something called the runways that we visited on Mount Diablo, couple of weeks ago when Adam and I went to the Adam Garightly and I went to the conspiracy convention. We went to, we were like, where should we go today? We had a free day, and we're like, let's go to Diablo. And then we drove and looked at it a little bit. And then the next day we were supposed to meet up with Louise Lacey, who was, she was the original, one of the early JFK researchers who, she's apparently read the Warren Commission like several times, the whole thing, because she was research editor at Ramparts magazine, and they were really the only magazine that gave a truthful, picture of what was going on with the JFK assassination. So it was interesting to hang out with her, but she took us to the same place. She said, I've got a place planned for you guys, the same exact area, east side of Diablo, which she says, hey, there's this area called the runways, which used to be an Indian area, and she was wanting us to guess what all had happened there. She never did tell us for some reason, but there's a sacred rock there that we hiked up to and so forth. But she said some interesting things, that this was an area that the black cowboys ride their horses in today still. And it's called Morgan Territory, so it's got a Moor name. Yeah. And by the way, did I ever mention that Johnny Morgan, you and I talked about the ghost box and how, the ghost box said that Morgan was the name of the Indrid Cold's either boss or Indrid Cold, that it was emanating from the name Morgan. Do you remember that at all? Well, it turns out that, and it also said Johnny might be his first name. And so I looked up Johnny Morgan and Googled it, and it turns out to be J.P. Morgan's nickname. And J.P. Morgan is the guy who probably more than anyone owns West Virginia other than the Rockefellers.
Right.
And in fact, he owned Columbia Gas, and Columbia Gas is who put in the pipeline that runs from my house to Harriet's and Tommy's house, where all the Mothman sightings were along this pipeline. And so it's almost like the ghost box was saying, hearkening to this aspect of it, that the pipelines, somehow, J.P. Morgan had something to do with this. And I think it's actually quite likely that Indrid Cold was some kind of agent for the Morgans or the Rockefellers, and probably was employed by one of the energy companies, either Columbia Gas or what today is AEP, because he lived in Midway, West Virginia, it's right next to the Winfield Locks, which is a big energy. It's a dam on the river that creates a lot of energy using turbines and stuff. So, and that's been there for a long, 100 years at least. So it's it's that old Masonic area that was owned by George Washington, and I've found more confirmation that Washington did indeed own that land. There's signs on the road that say that he owned it, but I've now found some stuff in, like Otis K. Rice's book on West Virginia, that Washington did indeed was given. It actually tells you how many acres he got, and it was a huge area. And so there's evidence there that Washington was colluding with the British, I think, before the war.
Of course.
And
yeah, I know.
I guess after the war, but all during that time. But anyway, my point was I was talking about Diablo and these runways, and it turns out that Louise had a book about the area, and we looked at it, and sure enough, the name of the god that they had a bird god that they worshipped, or that they would turn into, and it was Moloch. Huh. So here you have an Indian tribe in California with a bird god that's the same name as the Hebrew god of the same type. So how does that happen? And it actually lends credence to some of these Mormon beliefs that America was founded by, or had, there were Semitic peoples living here way before, the Europeans came, which again might explain the whole Ishmaelite tribe thing.
Well,
but
But I mean, Ishmael in the Bible is the one that gives seed to the Arab nations. That was the love child between Hagar and Abraham, and because Abraham wanted to help out God, you know the story, right? So yeah, and so of course, son Ishmael and Hagar are expulsed to the east, and were promised to be a great seed, and they were. So there you go. I mean, what you're looking at between Hebrews and Arabs are basically a feud between half brothers.
Yeah.
So
another thing that Louise said, that this gets back to something you said. You used a word a little while ago, platform, Masonic platform, and that got me going. Louise was saying that she went to a platform of sorts. She went to Sedona, Arizona, to one of their famous spots where you go and stand on top of a mountain. And she's a plant expert. She noticed that there were 11 types of plants on top of this, in this sacred spot, and that there were 2 versions of each one. And it was 11 and 11. And she had no idea that Adam and I had been talking about the 11-11 thing before, and that I found some examples of it. And I just thought that was a really random and strange thing. But I think I figured out where it comes from. Again, George Washington. I saw a picture this week of George Washington's apron, a Masonic apron that he was given by Lafayette or somebody. And it shows a platform, and it's usually got squares on it or something, like a tile room, square. And at each corner you've got columns. So there's 4 columns. And then they usually show them in perspective. So the 2 columns in the back are toward the middle. And if you look at it, it's 11 and 11. You see the numbers. I think this is why the Masons revere the date of November 11th. Mm-hmm. Because it's a corollary to their standard symbology of the platform room that has the columns at the 4 corners. And a lot of times it's just the column, it's just the platform and the 4 columns. There may not even really be much happening, above or below, or there's usually just some things floating in the room, floating in the space. But there were some other weird 11/11 things. Mothman started on November 11th. And one of the strange things that happened was that I've talked about a bit on your show. John Frick saw a man in black van that had the license plate 1111 a couple of years ago, and 2 people died that were close to him on November 11th, right after he saw the 1111 license plate. And then, I guess the most recent part of the story is that he told me that he got a weird phone call around that same time. By the way, I was getting some strange phone calls from the 00000 number, and Harriet was. But he also got a number that he traced to an address in Akron, Ohio. And it was 1111 Independence Avenue. And he was, a little freaked out about the 1111 thing. So, to make it even worse, I said, well, let's check out what is 1111 Independence Avenue. So I Googled it, and it turns out to be like attached to a mall. It's like the back edge of a mall that was once, and I researched the history of the mall, and it turns out it was once a sacred Indian site. And then I looked at the actual address, what was actually at the physical mailing address, and it's 2 apartment buildings that from the air look like the number 11. Each one looks like the number 1. Like it has It's hard to describe, but they look like the number. It looks like the number 11, the two buildings together. So what is that about? Is that like the ghosts of the Indians telling us something?
Well, another thing that struck me when you began this about 11 with Washington wearing his Masonic apron in that painting. But I mean, what was the name of the capsule that landed on the moon? Some would say supposedly, allegedly, or whatever, but Apollo 11. And of course, Armstrong would strap on his Masonic apron in whatever photos were taken up there.
Yeah. You see these. You can see these Masonic numbers all over the place in various governmental operations.
Yeah, but too. I mean, and I've since taken it beyond, because whatever the Masons embraced was there before Masonry. And to me, it was there right from the very beginning in Mystery Babylon Religion. And John Valentini, who had done that work on 9/11 subliminals and not so subliminal appearances in movies prior to 9/11, had once just written me about the fact that 9 and 11 are heavy occultic numbers. I mean, if you remember, nothing for nothing, but John Lennon, of course, was like all about number 9. But he also said that 9 and 11 flank the perfect number, which is 10, with the 1 being the phallic and the 0 being the ovum. So I have a tendency to believe there's probably something to that in symbology, and that is 9 and 11 are special numbers. And
a couple of things now that you've mentioned that. I did looked in Dean Radine's book, Entangled Minds. He did 2 experiments based on 911. He, collects data all the time on the internet from people who want to do psychic experiments. And he looked at the data for around 911, and he found that people, there was a noted absence of, and maybe I need to grab his book to let me look it up here.
Yeah, sure.
On my picture. I've got pictures of his charts in here. It's really interesting. There was a big drop off in thoughts of terrorism at that time. Statistically in the millions, like the odds of this happening are in the millions, that there would be this huge drop off in interest in that topic around this huge terrorism event. I'm pulling up the picture here.
Well, obviously the sickest thing about
huge drop prior to 911 indicated by the chart he has here. It suggests that participants were avoiding thinking about terrorism.
Well,
why is that? Was there some wave being sent out? Was there some mechanism by which we were being made to not think that something was going to happen? Or was this just a natural phenomenon?
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
And here's another chart. He actually did 2 of them, 2 different ones. And this other one says fluctuations in daily terrorism ideation scores. So this is the idea of terrorism. The dip at 911 suggests that participants were actively avoiding terrorism-related concepts just before 911. And he's got some examples in the book of people who had premonitions of it, though. Even though there was a drop in terrorism-related concepts, there were people that were having specifically very strong and definite precognitions of it. It's almost like sorry about that noise.
What is it, the garbage man coming down your back or what?
Yeah, it's almost like there's an overall amount of conceptualization that can occur about a certain topic, and then, but at times it can shift in its nature, and so suddenly instead of everybody thinking a little bit about terrorism, you suddenly had most people not thinking about it at all, and then a few people thinking about it so strongly that it became an image and a vision that they could palpably see the event before it happened. You see, so it's not that it's just like a coalescing of the concepts maybe it's a collective unconscious kind of thing. But you also have to wonder if, if there was something in the media happening, if they were sending out signals of some kind, either in the content of TV shows or ads or whatever, news programs that were getting people not to think about it for some, in order to make the shock and awe of it more strong. Now, the other thing you mentioned was Apollo 11. And I just found that during Apollo 11, there was a shriek that came across the radio that sounds like a Mothman shriek. And this is on YouTube. And it was in a TV show. It was like some paranormal TV show, did a little bit on it. But, there were a lot of UFOs and things seen on that trip. But also you have this, and it literally sounds like a huge bird shrieking, in this, god-awful, blood-curdling way. And the guys, on the radio are like, what was that? But we last talked on, February 17th. 2 days later, there was a Birdman sighting near Nick Redford's his old home in the United Kingdom. And some of these may not relate. I'm just going to go through and mention the ones that I highlighted. I found out, I talked about that I'd seen a fire. We'd seen a ghost fire like the previous Friday. We talked about that. I then got a letter from the New Mexico Fortean director, and she said that yes, people have been seeing ghost fires at that location. And then the next day, I got an email from somebody who had read my Mothman 2 book, and they said, Andy, did you know that the psychic Mina Bost, when she was doing your reading, she actually mentioned a fire in a cave, and that there was some connection to you with that fire and so forth. And she was right. So in a strange way, it was like the psychic had predicted my sighting of this ghost fire. And it was actually already printed in the book and everything before it happened. Now, just prior to that last show we did, there was a collision of a U.S. and USSR satellites. Do you remember that?
Nope.
They had collided, and I remember we talked about it at the time. Well, after we did that show, an article came out about that satellite collision, and they mentioned that, and this is the funny thing, is that sometimes in articles that come out a year or two later, suddenly the media will admit something that they sure as hell weren't admitting at the time of the event. And you always wonder, why didn't they just say that then? In this case, they mentioned that previous satellite that had come down. It was a year before that. It had come down over Peru, and everybody there had gotten sick. Do you remember that? Well, they claimed it was a UFO that made everybody sick, but
I do remember you talking about that. Yeah,
it was the flight path of that satellite. Right. Come on, So this dying satellite was coming down, and the Navy shot it with a missile. Do you remember that?
Yes,
George, I think W actually ordered it, and so the Navy was involved. And of course, the Navy does control all the satellites because the NSA is controlled by the Navy. But it said, the quote was, the U.S. used a naval missile to destroy a tank of toxic fuel on a defective U.S. spy satellite last February, so February 2008. Well, this proves what I was saying in 2008, that was all of those satellites are nuclear powered. So when they start to come back in and burn up in the atmosphere, it's just going to spread plutonium all over. I've actually read some stats on how much it would raise the overall, plutonium level, and it would result in increased cancers. Just one satellite burning up. So the Navy had to I guess, I'm assuming they have somewhat good motives that they would want that to not happen. So they shot the satellite down before it hit while it was still outside the ionosphere. Okay. But so they're probably going to have to do this with all of these satellites. I don't know if if there's any way that the plutonium still comes back in or not.
It really won't matter after the Third World War, after everybody's nuked everybody.
And then regarding 911 again, there's another note here I had made. It says, in The Last Jihad by Joel Rosenberg, there's a plane scenario prior, just like 911, a plane crashing into buildings. Are you familiar with that at all?
Not Rosenberg's, no.
So, and this guy's been accused of being a CIA asset, and Rush Limbaugh endorsed his book. So that tells you that the bad guys, had this idea beforehand to do this. Okay, moving on to March. March was pretty slow.
Let me just stop you for a second?
Yeah.
Only because I don't want this to get lost. I just feel like I should say it. And we probably talked about this too, and I know I've done it without you. But that whole idea of writing something that looks like a prescient book, that whole thing with Keating, who wrote the book The Final Jihad. Are you familiar with that? It was Martin Keating, I believe, the brother of then Oklahoma governor.
That's funny. They have the same name. Final Jihad versus Last Jihad. Jesus.
Yeah, well, in the Final Jihad, really quick, I'll go through this. If I said it to you, fine, but maybe for folks who hadn't listened, let me just get to it. The book was written in 91. It was a manuscript that was copyrighted at the Library of Congress, but the book didn't come out until like 96. So you have this manuscript laying around that was like 700 pages or more, and then the book does come out, but in that book, so in other words, he wrote this manuscript prior to these events. The Murrah building bombing in Oklahoma City, the 7/7 bombing in London in the subway, and we can talk, who knows, but there was an event that Harry and I talked about. If you remember, the American airline crew leaving LAX for Chicago, called in the fact that a SAMI, surface-to-air missile, had just missed them on their ascent.
Mm-hmm.
You remember this?
Yeah.
Well, Keating has all three events in his book. In his book, the SAMI does drop a plane, I believe, coming out of L.A. He has a bombing on the tracks, but this would be in Jersey. And he has a bombing in Oklahoma City. So here he writes about this in 91. They hold the manuscript back, and then the book comes out in 95. And it doesn't look prescient anymore. So here you go. So I just had to throw that in there. Yeah, The Last Jihad, The Final Jihad. And it's Keating's brother. And Keating, like I said, was governor of Oklahoma at the time of the Murrah building bombing. And he was former FBI, too. So it makes you wonder. Thanks for letting me do that.
Okay. Well, March 1st, George Navy, that's my name for George Norrie, George Navy, did a show on an alien that had been drowned in a man's bathtub by the man.
He's got more balls than I would. I have.
Well, the thing is that, nothing had gone on. February was really quiet. There's just, well, I also forgot to mention on February 20th, Atlantis was found. That was the same day that I found out about, the cave fire stuff. And, or at least the story was that they had found Atlantis and that it was right off of, Western Africa, Iberia, off the Straits of Gibraltar, which oddly enough is where I thought the cave and the fire thing was happening. When she was talking about the cave and the fire, I was visualizing the Straits of Gibraltar for some reason. And then that same day they say, hey, we found Atlantis right off the Straits of Gibraltar. But I don't know what happened with that. I think they tried to debunk the whole thing and it kind of disappeared. But, so then it's the beginning of March, it starts heating up a bit, and whenever they have a real blatant BS story like, oh, I drowned an alien in my bathtub, you have to start to wonder if there's a surge coming, if there's like a propaganda surge coming, because Norrie seems to really go along with all that stuff. He's always, his news stuff, the stuff he talks about where he's talking about the hardcore news stuff is usually pretty good. And this is the beauty of it. You know, he'll give you some seemingly reasonable coverage of conspiratorial political events, and then, you know, he'll bring on the guy who, you know, time travels, you know, like Al Bielek, or this guy who drowned an alien in his bathtub, and it just decimates the rest of the material, and I think it marginalizes the entire field of reasonable research into political conspiracy.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, that's their story. We used to always crack up about that. You know, they're going to do serious research into the Kennedy assassination or 9/11, and then the next thing you get is like, you know, shadow monkeys and flying rods. And, you know, and then Jones pops up there and Steve Quayle. And what I was saying in a previous show, Andy, not that it matters, I mean, I won't go into it now, but what I see happening is this kind of like really bizarre melding of like the cretins who follow Nure, those who follow Beck, and those who follow Jones. Because they're all starting to meet at the same place to a certain extent. Although Beck and Jones are sometimes critical, or their people are, of each other, you know, Beck is selling Jones's tape, the Obama deception. You know, I mean, there is some kind of homogenization going on here. And really what it does is, like you said, and that's what I accuse that con of, and I call it the con. And that is, you know, if you're going to you want to do stuff on MUFON, that's great. Do a MUFON conference. And you all have done that. I know Adam has done that. If you're going to have a conference on serious geopolitical stuff and conspiracy history, fine. But when you throw them all together, what are you really doing? Except marginalizing, and that's what was the trigger word that you just mentioned, the real honest look into what is really going on. And I see that happening now. And I see a whole lot of people going down that vortex. Don't even call it a freaking rabbit hole. It's a vortex. So, yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you for saying that. You didn't know that I was going to confirm that, or affirm it, not that you needed to have you do that. But, yes, you're right.
I think they stepped up their efforts in regard to this. Yes. As soon as the Internet became big, you know, 10 years ago, you know, the military started pumping a lot more money into the Internet than getting all this UFO stuff out because, you know, there's so much more access now to conspiratorial material that's relevant, you know, like who did what at the JFK assassination or whatever, you know, whatever event you want to look at, there's a lot of stuff on it now that people don't have to go spending a lot of money to find. And this has the plutocracy worried. And I think that this may be why they cooked up the whole UFO abduction phenomenon in the beginning, was to have it all ready to go, that they could really start pumping it out when, you know, as things get hotter politically and people's standards of living go down as they are, they're just going to pump out more and more of the UFO stuff. And, of course, there's a terroristic vibe to the abduction phenomenon, which, again, increases that stress that I was talking about. And that, in turn, increases people's real experiences with the paranormal, which there are some real experiences. I don't think, you know, an alien, a flying saucer landing in your yard and aliens coming in is usually a real thing. I don't. But I think a lot of the lights that people see and then just strange synchronistic messages and things are real. But
Andy, you know,
that situation, and you know, the same people that they're now organizing a big UFO conference there, and it's the same people that organize the conspiracy conference. So they're actually doing both. But you know, in the case of the con, it was a mix of the two.
Oh, yeah. I mean, actually three, because then you had Tessari and those ghouls. You know, to me, and then like the occult type, and then you got the paranormal UFO type, and then you have the supposed historical geopolitical conspiracy people.
There was way more UFO stuff there than conspiracy stuff. I can say that. There's a massive industry cranking out these DVDs. That are really, I think most of them are bootlegs. I don't even know that they're being properly paid for. But they've just taken talks by UFO guys and of the worst stripe, David Icke and all that, and just, they've got these massive banks of hundreds of DVDs, all, I would, bad quality and just there to get people off the track.
Well, but you see that the internet, I get the emails, let's do what we can while the internet's still alive. They're never going to take they're never ever going to take the internet away. That's too valuable for the elites, those who would like to mass manipulate and such. And when you're saying pumping a lot of money into the internet or whatever, because they might be the plutocracy might be a little bit frightened. I would say I would counter that and just say no. A little money goes a long way, because you got enough maniacs out there anyway. I mean, absolute bull goose loony characters who are throwing enough wrenches into the situation. I mean, if you were to say anything, or if you watch mainstream news, when they want to demonize something, they would go, well, it was one of those internet things. Now, there's a lot of good information on the internet. These government agencies are telling people what they're doing, and they're on the internet with a .gov, site. So we know that there's a lot of good stuff out there, but still to this day, you can get Joe, Public out there. If you say what was on the internet, he'll immediately just, because he's propagandized, say, okay, it's bullshit because it was on the internet. So what I'm saying is that this is a great tool that's working for the benefit of those who do not want to be uncovered. And I don't see there's a reason why the internet is in jeopardy at all. The only thing I could see happening later on is that you're going to be charged for it, like emails and such.
Yeah, and they'll filter out the search engine somewhat.
Yeah. So I mean, no, folks. It'll always be with us, because this is going to be a tool of re-indoctrination in the wonderful world to come. Yeah. And so anyway, but no, Andy, I tell you, really, you got instigation by the powers that be to debunk good information, but then you have, without them having to do a thing, just a rampant bunch and many a number of just idiots that are undoing a lot of good stuff. So, whatever.
Well, I was right, because the next day after George Navy, moving on, and the alien, there was the AIG bailout was announced. So, I think a lot of the stuff we've been seeing lately is just to get everybody off of the fact that they've ripped off the Treasury to the tune of $1 trillion to bail out the banks, and then the banks aren't giving us any of the money so that we can what do you call that? When you get new mortgages for your home,
refinance, reamortize, or
finance. Yes.
Yeah. I'm not the only one losing my mind, huh?
Yeah. So at the end of that week, that was, I think, your main thing that week. And then the next week, a bunch of shootings started. And that's when things really started to heat up in advance of April, because we always know that April is going to be a big month.
Yeah. And
usually March is a big month too, although this one wasn't that big. But they did start the shootings at a New Jersey church shooting. Well, that was a couple of months before that. But they had a church shooting in Illinois on the 8th, a shooting at the Crystal Cathedral in February. And on the 8th, they cut that was when they announced that they were cutting troops in Iraq. So in order to, I think, point out to us how bad it is that we have to cut troops in Iraq, they have a church shooting. And so it makes the troop cutting seem just as bad as a church shooting.
But there was a whole bunch more other shootings too, I think. There was a rash of them that went on.
Well, right. 2 days later, we have shootings in Alabama and Germany where, like 15 girls were shot or something. And it was the 5-year of the Madrid attacks, that the 10th and 11th of March. I don't know if it was the 10th or the 11th. It was one of them. And on the 10th, a Greek leftist group took credit for February February attacks on Citibank in Athens. So that's a Rockefellerian terrorism thing creeping up right as you have the school shootings or these church shootings. And the anniversary with the prior terrorist attack, it's, you know, they've now begun, you know, their surge on us. And that just happens to be the same week that the Madoff trial starts. Madoff actually came to court on the 11th. So these shootings start right at the same time. And as I've said before, every time anybody, you know, on the plutocracy's side is in court or testifying, you always have school shootings of some kind of mass shootings. There was also a provocation between China and the U.S. Navy about our boats being in their waters. They sentenced the Bush shoe guy, the guy that threw a shoe at Bush on the 11th, to 3 years in prison. They began the AIG hearings the next week on why they were giving bonuses. On the 19th, the Manson photo is released. For some reason, the media wanted to start talking about Charles Manson again. It seems like they perhaps knew that Sarah Jane Moore was about to be released.
Exactly.
Even though there's still no connection being made between them in the media at all.
Hi, neighbor.
Yeah. A flying car was successfully tested on the 19th, which is a paranormal kind of image that's come up before. People have seen these flying cars in their visions, sort of like seeing a UFO. On the 21st, the Pope condemned Angolan sorcery. Iran snubbed Obama. AIG paid out $218 million in bonuses, or that revelation came forth. There was a crash in San Diego where money was strewn about the interstate. And I'm not sure what the money thing, there's a couple of those stories. I'm not sure what their purpose is, if there is a purpose for them. But that was pretty much it for March. And in April, things really start to get going. There's last week of March, like the 29th, there's a nursing home shooting in North Carolina where the guy shot up the whole nursing home. The guy decapitated his 5-year-old sister in Boston, and the police said it made no sense. So those were totally senseless. Well, I guess in the one case, the guy was going after his wife at the nursing home who worked there. But then on the 30th, mysterious boom and flash in Norfolk, Virginia, a North Korean missile scare, and a big drop in housing costs, home prices was announced. A man was found with a spear in his head. I can't go into all the reasons why these are in my list, but there is a reason for the spear in the head thing. We have a lot of decapitation stories that seem to flow in at certain times, or head trauma, you know, the whole head trauma, Masonic thing. On the 31st of March, the Caterpillar execs in France were taken hostage. Obama went to Europe. Russia started talking about getting volunteers to go to Mars. The Taliban suddenly started threatening the U.S. This is all stuff they're just cooking up. They're just cooking up whatever to get April, going. And, this Taliban stuff is just as bogus as the Al-Qaeda stuff. Obama met the Queen on the 1st of April. Riots broke out that same day over the G20 meetings. The salvia plant was labeled dangerous, so that's the alternative sort of to pot is salvia. And that was another thing. They started as soon as the bank bailouts, that whole issue was floating around and everybody was all pissed off. They started talking about pot, legalizing pot. Mm-hmm. And that would seem like a strange diversion from something else that was more important. Some more senseless murders at the end of the week. Graham, Washington, which is kind of a UFO New Age town. Father killed his family. There were some New Jersey men who went to court on the 5th for pulling a UFO hoax. You know, they were actually convicted, I think. They put off a bunch of flares and claimed it was UFOs. You gotta wonder why people do that. What's the purpose? And any of these hoaxes that involve the paranormal, the guys involved usually have law enforcement backgrounds or something. North Korea launched a rocket in, quote, defiance. A Pittsburgh man killed 3 police officers over a dog peeing incident. He cited Obama's gun restrictions as to the media, so they started amping up this gun thing using one of the shooters' actual comments, supposedly. Then we had a bunch of earthquakes. We had an Italian earthquake on the 6th. We had, and you know, these earthquakes can be triggered pretty easily with infrasonic weapons. And you know, the infrasonic thing has come up lately. There's been 2 or 3 planes that have gone down for no apparent reason. And it could be the Nazi International that's doing this, because one of Mae Brussels' staples was that the Nazis had engineered a lot of the downings of planes in the 70s, the McDonnell Douglas planes, because of corporate warfare between the different plane companies. The Nazis had sided with, I guess, Airbus at the time.
Probably.
And so they took down McDonnell Douglas by having all these McDonnell Douglas planes fall apart in midair. And all they got to do to make that happen is put a little device on the plane, turn it on, and it does it. You know, within a few minutes, the plane disintegrates because they're very thinly made.
And yet we've had 2 notable droppings of Airbuses.
Yeah.
The Hudson River landing, which I believe, was just the way it goes, because birds are a problem, more so than people know. But then, of course, you have the one that people still ask questions about, which is the French Airbus that went into the drink off the Brazilian coast.
And this may be what happened at the Silver Bridge. I think that they could have easily put one of these little boxes on the bridge, and that would explain why people were seen on the bridge, and that would explain why the bridge came down when it did, perhaps, assuming they wanted to, I don't know. My best explanation is that they wanted to get Point Pleasant off of the map. They wanted people to not be going there. They were doing something there, and I think it may have been uranium, something related to nuclear material, probably. I noticed that Point Pleasant is in the flight path between where the Kecksburg thing fell out of the sky. It looked like the Nazi Bell weapon, right? And one of my theories is they were building the Nazi Bell weapon in Charleston, near Point Pleasant, because that was the only Buddha plant in the world other than the one in Germany, which had been supposedly building the early UFOs. They were using the Buddha plant in Germany as a cover for UFO manufacture or saucer manufacturing. And the guy in charge of it, Dornberger, was actually brought over and hired by Bell Helicopter and ran it for a long time afterwards in Dallas. But they were probably using the Buddha plant in Institute as a cover for more of the same after the war was over. And that might explain why all the UFOs, this is the biggest West Virginia had the biggest UFO flap ever, really, in terms of total numbers. So it would explain, if they were manufacturing a few saucers there, why. And it would also explain the abductions, too, because if you've got the saucers, and you could also go around and do some mind control on the, people living in rural areas around there who would never go to a psychologist. Because, the easiest way to mind control somebody is to get them into a psychiatrist's office. Some psychiatrist who's linked to the cryptocracy. But if you can't do that, well, there's really no way to do anything to them except, go out to their homes and do it in the middle of the night or whatever. And so they built this enormous, field of endeavor, alien abduction. I mean, it's just enormous how many people believe in it, spend money on it, go to conferences, the whole thing. And I do feel like that, may have started right there in Point Pleasant or near there.
And by the way, we were talking with, like you didn't know, Andrew Colvin. The website is andycolvin.com. He has made some changes there. I haven't talked to him about it, but maybe this is a good time. And also, Andy, do you want to tell folks what edition you have of The Mothman's Photographer that's out right now?
Yeah, that's Mothman's Photographer 3, West Coast people, witnesses, and different experts in different fields. It's got we've got an interview with Charles Manson in there, with David Lynch. These aren't ones that I did, but ones that are in the public domain, I guess. And it's like one thing I wanted to mention was John Keel died this week.
Right.
And he, I hadn't really planned on talking about him, but, it feels like, it should be mentioned. And it sort of happened along with a lot of other deaths that have this last week, like Michael Jackson and Farrah Fawcett and
Steve McNair and Gail Storm, Ed McMahon. I mean, it's been like a massacre.
Yeah, and Keel died as well, and I just wanted to mention that I've got several of his talks on Mothman transcribed in the Mothman 2 book. So for those that are thirsting for more, John Keel, I guess I don't want to be like turning his eulogy into a promo spot or anything, but
that's all right.
I guess, I can't even describe his importance, not only in the field of the paranormal, but in my own life. I simply would not be here saying anything I'm saying if it wasn't for him. And there's so many people like that out there who were deeply touched by John Keel. He was, when I first met him at the festival, like in 2003, I honestly think he's an enlightened person, and some of the recent, stories about him, sort of paint him as in a bad light. They make him seem like he was lonely or paranoid or whatever, and I just didn't get that impression. He just seemed to me like almost like a Buddha-like figure. He had this amazing objectivity and calmness about it, and he wasn't attached to. He's not attached to any of the concepts that he came up with. Even I think he's totally so open-minded or aware that none of the specific theories are enough to explain the totality of it. I think he sees the totality of it so well that he knows it can't be fully comprehended by the human mind, because the human mind just is too linear. And the minute you start breaking things down in your mind, you lose the essential unity of wholeness. And I could cite some writers that I've been reading lately who really speak eloquently about that topic, how the human mind affects our conceptual abilities.
But I don't know if you realize it or not, but what you just said now goes back to what you had said earlier about segmentizing information across information, or what we would call news outlets. It's the same thing. And it does.
I would cite George Simmel, Simmel, a great sociologist from Europe, who wrote really deeply about how our modes of social modes affect the capabilities that we have for thinking.
Two things. One, like I said, what you just said reminds me of what you said before, which is obviously resonates about, I guess, the negative side of compartmentalization, deconstruction, just like what you had said, and how you lose the original essence when you try to break it down. The other thing I got to tell you is, what was the movie that started somewhat of an interest in Mothman? Was it the Richard Gere Mothman movie?
Yes.
You know, I only saw that for the first time a couple of months ago.
How did you? What do you think?
Well, because of what has gone down between ourselves, these many years, I just sat back and, I mean, whatever, you know, it all gets Hollywooded no matter what. And I'm like, nah, you know, all right. I don't know. I guess I could never look at it straight. You know what I mean? So I just kind of didn't like the movie. What was your take on it?
I liked the tone of it. I thought the tone was, you know, there's a place I go in my mind when I think back to those times, and I get a visual feeling for it. And even, you know, the memory works that way, and I always created that sort of. Always felt. I remember the mist hanging over the woods at night, and the sort of the way the people are. Getting back to the social network that's there in a certain area affects so many things, and who knows where it came from. Maybe it comes from the mounds, or it comes from some of the mountain peoples of Europe who settled there. I mean, who knows? But there's this vibe, and you've talked about it, or maybe it was Denton who was talking about it. When you go into these mound areas, the people just are different, and there's this real understatedness to everything. And then at other times, it's dramatically the opposite, and it's craziness, absolute craziness. And that comes across in the movie. I think the director, he's a talented guy. I saw the making of the Mothman Prophecies, and he's a talented guy. But there's some other stuff going on there too, though, that gets into other realms. Just when you watch how the movie was made and the dynamics and the vibe and everything.
Cinematically,
creepiness comes across in in the documentary too, and of course the director, he lost his wife soon after that in a similar manner of some sort.
Cinematically, it had a pretty decent. I hate to sound like these idiot critics, but I mean it evoked a certain ambience, if you will, as you said, a bit of film noir and all that, and that was fine. I'm not a real big Richard Gere guy, and I also was trying to have to winnow out what was somewhat factual from what Hollywood did to it. But to be, you know, in the river town, what river town did they shoot that in anyway? Or did they shoot it in a river town?
Well, it was, what was that? It was in Pennsylvania. What was the name of that town? I remember it was in that county, though, that Iron Mountain has their headquarters.
Oh, that would be Allegheny. Allegheny County.
It was Butler. I'm sorry.
Butler?
Butler County, yes.
Okay, Butler County, sure. All right, that's where they shot it. All right. So they shot Pennsylvania for West Virginia, huh?
Yeah.
All right. But that's it. I'm not like I said, I'm not a big Richard Gere fan, but in the way that you talked about it with a certain feel, without a doubt.
Well, there were a couple of things in the movie that I was creeped out by because they weren't part of the Mothman story, but they were part of my story. Like, for instance, there's a scene where they look into a sink, and I think there's a crack in the sink or something, but there's a howling coming from the sink. And nowhere is that found in the official story, but they just put it in there. Well, yeah. I've made jokes about that same image for years, and I've got another friend who's joked about it as well, and He's actually in the second book. We had a paranormal sighting together once, but so really sort of random things that I was either already interested in or had happen. So, it's not telling the same story, but it's getting something else was right about it. The theme of death.
You also were talking about Keel and how he has been painted by certain personages as in a less than favorable light, and it's interesting because and I think I can relate more to this. When you're by yourself and you don't want to be, you call it lonely. When you're by yourself and you want to be, you call it solitude.
Yes.
And I would think someone like Keel, and because he was, let's face it, exceptional, may have been in a solitudinal state. And, like one of the acutes said to Nurse Ratched in Cuckoo's Nest, are you saying it's sick to want to be by yourself? Well, they would have us believe that, but I'll tell you what, it's looking pretty good to me. And I like it a lot now. So at any rate, but and again, what we're talking about too in this whole concept that we're just touched upon and where we left off before we did a little business, and that was the whole bit about the mind and, how you can look at things and how you can be manipulated. And I think that's where we were going to a certain amount, Andy, and that is mind manipulation, probably as it relates to what's going on right now. Is that more or less where you wanted to go?
Yeah. It's almost a question of what are the stress UFOs. Which UFOs are stress UFOs, I would call them, because they create their stories that are in the media that may or may not be true, that have to do with UFOs, or their UFO events that were caused by, say, a real nuts and bolts craft that we have developed in secret that we use to go out and mess with people, with. Those would be stress UFOs. And then the real ones would be, I think, things that are more organic, like balls of light. Even though those, I think probably today could be synthetically done. They certainly were trying that out in the Mothman days. There were some cases in New York that were really interesting, involving men in black who were pointing devices at UFO researchers and knocking them out, even, hitting them with beams from these devices, from cars, usually it was large black cars, the standard man in black look. But then it morphed into, the Volkswagen, which made its appearance on my street, my neighborhood. And then I just recently found that in New York there was a blue Volkswagen that was seen in during some of these same events where people were being blasted with rays. And in this blue VW, this is like 1968 in the spring in New Jersey. The researcher's name, it'll have to come back to me. He's in Tim Beckley's UFO Silencers book. That's where you can find this. This had West Virginia plates, and it had three men in it who looked just like John Keel, Gray Barker, and James Mosley. But it wasn't those three guys. They were impersonators who were going around and harassing UFO researchers. So that's a really strange, and it was shown that these weren't the guys. The witness called them on the phone, and they said, "No, we're still in it." But Gray Barker's like, "I'm still in West Virginia." So there was some cross pollination going on between New York and West Virginia with these men in black. And I'm just taking this to its logical conclusion. Let's say they first start off with these devices that are powered from cars, and maybe the guy running this operation is David Ferry. because even though he supposedly died in 1968, there's been a couple of other Men in Black incidents where the guy looked like him or could have been him, I think. The Herbert Hopkins case, where this doctor was visited by a man who sounds a lot like David Ferry. And then the Johnny Sands case in Nevada, which involved a hairless person and also involved a sphere of some kind that could create mind control that Ferry or whoever it was using to hypnotize people with. And interestingly, in the Silver Bridge book, and I would plug the new version of that at this point. You can get the new Silver Bridge reissue on Amazon now. But in there, Barker talks about this silver ball that fell during Mothman in the area, and it had these odd properties. Actually, it was gold. I'm sorry, it had some sort of gold coating, but on the inside it was impenetrable, and it was never figured out what it was. Well, again, that's on the flight line between Columbus and like if you were flying, say, between the Wright-Patterson and Fort Detrick, or I forget which fort it was, someplace on one of the major bases on the East Coast, Kecksburg and Point Pleasant could sort of be in that line.
Are you saying an Air Force base?
Yeah, I may have to. I would have to look at my drawing here to remember.
Oh well, you either got
something
in South Jersey. You have Andrews, just north of D.C.
People can do this, and I'll do it when I'm done here. If you draw a line between Point Pleasant and Kecksburg, where does it extend in either direction?
Okay.
That might tell us something about what was being done. I have the suspicion that it has to do with the Nazi Bell weapon, because it supposedly used these spheres that were used in the gyroscopic sort of thing. It would spin at such high rates that it could create this field that was like a nuclear explosion but bigger, if you wanted to blow it up, for instance. But it could also just generate strange electromagnetic fields that had bizarre effects on everything around it. So that was going on in New York at the same time, or right after the Silver Bridge collapse. It was almost like they decided to move from Point Pleasant after the bridge collapse. They all went to, Long Island, or maybe set up the Montauk thing or something. It sort of, Keel certainly spent a lot of time out on Long Island trying to figure out what was going on out there. Probably had to do with Brookhaven labs, and supposedly there's an underground train between the two, Montauk and Brookhaven. So, anyway, the evolution of it could have been from the car to say, some flying craft. Then they use the flying craft to go around and mind control folks or shoot beams at them or whatever they're doing. Then it could have even perhaps evolved into the satellite technology, which, and this may be, I actually think there may be something to that because it's the one that's the most heavily debunked. The theory that you want to throw out to really debunk somebody is whether or not they think a satellite can mind control them. That's so far out, everybody just loses all interest. But, a lot of things point to that. The crop circles are being made with lasers from satellites. That's pretty precise stuff. One imagines that they could easily dial in whatever frequency they wanted and point it at someone. And, of course, you have a lot of people claiming this, too. But we do have a lot of satellite links and satellite clues all throughout this story. Also, cell phone clues. naval, intelligence things. I guess naval intelligence is a lot of researchers, I think, probably feel that it's more of a Navy intelligence operation than any other branch. Because they were involved in some of the early Blue Book, I think, some of the Blue Book publications maybe. It's been a while since I've read about the Navy stuff, but anyway, that could have been the kind of evolution that occurred, or that they were trying to work on there. And that may be, if that organization, if that sort of matrix that we see there, the petrochemicals, data mining, in West Virginia, those could somehow be linked to the Nazi International, then you would be getting into an area that it's sort of the cutting edge, I think, today of some of the research that the Nazi International was, linked into these things in certain ways. And Mae Brussel, actually, I wanted to throw this date out, and then I'll close. On June 11th, 1984, she gave a radio show where she was talking about Nazi UFOs, the Nazis being behind the UFO abduction phenomenon. And that was right around the same time, that was the year after Gray Barker had written his Man in Black book, where he sort of alluded to the same things. So that was kind of around the time when Reagan was, in power, that some of this stuff was leaking out. And it sort of disappeared for a few years, I think maybe because of the times or something. But it didn't reappear until like the 1990s, really, that topic. So she was pretty far ahead of the game. But her whole, that was basically her whole theme, was that the Nazi International was there, they were real, they were, doing terrorism and financial scams, and that may be why she was targeted. And one of the interesting things I learned at the Con was that she was rumored to have been given cancer by a needle in a seat cushion. And when and I don't know if that was, it's so specific to my dad's story that I almost felt like, is somebody just floating this story to get me going on the idea? Is this a real thing? But, that's basically what happened to my dad, is that he got cancer right there where you sit in its seat. And
let me share something with you, okay?
Yeah.
I heard this from my brother-in-law, and it's been some time, but he attended a wedding, which I think was the wedding of the son of former CIA Director Colby. He had a New York wedding, and my brother-in-law, who's not given to hyperbole, was saying that there was talk. I don't know how it came around, and he was kind of like, "Oh yeah," that the CIA executed Bob Marley with a needle in his boot.
Yeah, I think we talked about that.
There you go again, another forgotten moment from Vyzygoth.
Yeah, I read that a few years ago, and it's always stayed with me. That's a really important story because it reveals that they were using needles to give people cancer. And I think my dad was one of the early victims of this. I think, they rolled it out, so to speak, the technology, they rolled it out on what was needed at the time. And at the time, they were trying to crush the union movement. So they went after union activists.
Andrew, nobody will be able probably ever to do the research and come out with a book, because if the book was written, it'd be suppressed. How many times our government has allowed testing on its people? And of course, it kills its people, like on 9/11 or the Lusitania or Pearl Harbor, when it needs to advance a certain agenda. That's what government's about. Get over it. But can you imagine, though, Andrew, really how many times we've been tested and we don't even know it? And it's no doubt going on right now. And when you mentioned before about satellite-directed beams, I think of all the people who have been ridiculed, denigrated, demonized, and otherwise about saying this psychotropic or electronic harassment does go on. And everybody wants to know why. But they don't know. It could really be the fact that they're just being picked out at random to be experimented on. And those poor people will probably go insane to their grave and have been right all along. And I mean, I know you can relate to that too for personal reasons as well.
Yeah. But another thing, just to move on to one more thing before I forget about it, is at that conference I also heard that well, there was a couple things I'd like to. I'll just stay real general in nature with it. But there seems to be a pattern out there of researchers who are on coast to coast, who get that kind of whatever, and who are also behind the scenes engaging in how do you say this? Seemingly shady, financial things, like they'll get other researchers to invest on something, and then the money disappears, and it seems to be the same guys. You hear the same names over and over who are doing this, and so I think people wonder, what's the harm in George Norrie's show or having such a monopolized, I guess, point of view be placed, or strange mix of things being placed out there. I got distracted there by the garbage truck. All right. Ask me a question.
No, and you said you were gonna close things up. I mean, I have a final question or comment that you could hit off. You probably will be reminded of what you were left off with. I mean, because you knew where you were going, and I didn't. But the thing that you said, I mean, first of all, you were talking about assassinations and testing on people. You were talking about Mae Brussels. But the one thing, I mean, if we can close on this, and we can pick it up anytime you want to when we reconvene, and pick it up at this point. But you talked about something, if I got it right, you talked about, shall we say, benign and malevolent UFOs. Would that be okay to categorize what you had been talking about?
Yeah.
Well, because it struck me as this. Look, we know something's going on, and we know the government fully knows. They wouldn't have left this situation in the mess that it's been in, I mean, since the 60s. I mean, I remember, as I told you, I mean, I read Incident at Exeter, I think in 65. There were some sightings in New Jersey which they couldn't just poo-poo away, and one of them was the Oradell Reservoir disk in the wintertime, which melted a perfect circle in the ice on the reservoir, and they told us it was swamp gas. But the thing is that it's out there, and if part of this, if this, quote, malevolent side of it has to do with something extremely supernatural, and I would say demonic, we are in deep, deep sneakers. And that's all I have to know. To get caught in the whole muck about whether it's their stuff or our stuff. I mean, if there is an element out there truly that is supernatural, then it's not going to bode well for humanity come one day.
Well, I remember the other thing I was going to mention was this, and maybe I can go into this more next time. I'll just mention that we had this strange sighting of a squirrel, a black squirrel.
Yeah, I remember that. Okay.
Which isn't that unknown there, but Adam had never seen one, and he thought it was unusual for him. And so...
So what, did Adam drop down to his knees and worship it? No, black squirrel. I'm kidding. All right.
Well, it looked at me like hey, take my picture, and stood there. And as soon as I started taking the camera out, started running away like, haha, you're not going to take my picture. And I actually said to Adam, you're not going to get away from me. I got you. And I took a picture of it as it ran way over across the parking lot. And then we looked at it later, and there's a guy seemingly watching us from the tennis court on the other side of the parking lot, and there was no one else out there. The parking lot was pretty much empty. It was a big parking lot. The guy was far away, and we wouldn't have noticed him. But he's like smoking a cigarette, and he looks pretty sinister. And well, I guess the thing I'm pointing at here is that the animal animals can give you clues, like the phenomenon can give you clues to stuff that's going on, and just create a little coincidence that shows you something. And I mean, maybe he was just a guy standing there, but why is a guy smoking a cigarette on an empty tennis court? And he just kind of has that ex-FBI look to him, So,
maybe he's a trainer for the black squirrel.
Maybe. And well, it turned out that Adam had seen a doppelganger. Someone had seen Adam's doppelganger. And so I started thinking about doppelgangers and Adam's research into Carrie Thornley, who was Oswald's doppelganger. And it sort of synchronized with a new clue to the JFK thing, about who was this Oswald double, who was actually filmed in Dealey Plaza. And I was saying that it might be Carrie Thornley based on the synchronicities, or someone linked to Carrie Thornley, because there were two or three other guys in his Marine unit with Oswald who looked like Oswald, and probably were involved later when the hit went down. So that was a line of we still don't know who that guy is. Essentially, but it led to some interesting theorizing, and one of the theories was that the squirrels are anomalous, perhaps, in this area of Santa Clara because it was once covered with mounds, it turns out. In fact, there's a huge Virgin Mary shrine right across the street from it.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, and so even on the West Coast, we have Thunderbird-like, deities and mounds and strange paranormal events that, like the Virgin Mary sightings. So and one other little thing that I recently found out about mounds, or at least this mound, we actually have a mound in Seattle. I found this out about the same time as this the conspiracy convention. And I went down there and checked it out, and they've totally covered up the story. They're saying that this is the only mound that survived the Ice Age because the ice just happened to miss it. And so then that there weren't any other mounds down there, which you really find hard to believe because of all the Thunderbird symbologies and things. They usually go along with mounds. But anyway, this mound has it has a super high magnetism reading at the bottom of the mound and no reading at the top, like neutral. Or, it's the lowest reading you can get. And the guy that did the research is named Michael Trento. I think it's Michael. No, Sal.
Sal, yeah.
And sure enough, it's called Poverty Hill. So the area today, and so you figure Indians were, living there, and there's actually people living on this mound on one end of it. So that's kind of odd. And apparently they're very supportive of the mound, the people that live there, because they were actually going to dynamite it. They'd been wanting to dynamite it for years.
Oh, that was a mainstream story about people who want to maintain it because it's also some kind of, you would call it a historical site. And this was going on in Seattle, wasn't it? And then you got developers that want to just blow the thing away and put something else in there.
Well, yeah, it's got 40 million year old fossils in it.
Oh, who the hell cares about that?
Yeah, it's like an old outcropping of some kind.
Yeah, I did read that. Okay.
And, yeah, but it has been purchased now by the city, so it's protected. Although you can't go on in there and look at anything because it's taking them years to finish the. They're going to put all it is put in a path or two and some benches. Well, it seems to be taking time, so. I don't know
what they're doing there while nobody's looking. Yeah.
I don't know why. Yeah. But we tried to go in and we couldn't get in. They actually have signs saying, videotaping in progress, do not enter.
Now, was that site also related to a particular Aboriginal tribe?
The Duwamish.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That's and there you have that Duwa name. Which means thunderbird in I guess it's New Guinea.
Okay.
Okay. And there was a sighting there. In 2004, a guy saw a birdman on one of the islands right off of New Guinea. It's called Manus Island. And there's been some sightings of Indaba lights. So you're seeing the same thing there. You're seeing birdmen and lights that are inexplicable, and that the propaganda coming out is that people are scared of them. But I would bet that there's people there that don't see it that way.
No.
Although they are John Keel interfaced with some lights that were neutral. They didn't harm him, but there were other lights that were where farmers said, don't go in that part. Don't go in with the purple lights. Like if the whole forest is lit up, don't go in because you'll disappear, or like a vortex that opened up or something. But if it's these balls of light that just sort of fly around, he had several witnesses to the fact that he would interact with these lights.
Well, do you remember they had a whole episode about that? I can't remember when it was. It might have been in the 70s on an island off the coast of South America. And they brought like the army down there and they confirmed it all. Does that ring a bell at all?
No, but that's an interesting, we'll have to do one of that next time.
Yeah, and I think the police chief that was involved in it, or the military head that was involved with it, committed suicide, supposedly. Oh, and this is years after. All right, I'll see if I can dig that up, but that's another thing famous. I mean, there's not a problem that this was going on, and it was having some impact, and a doctor was dealing with the fallout and such, and they brought the military down and chronicled it, and no. So, if I can find that, I'll let you know. I'm sure there's some folks out there, too, who saw it. I don't know what kind of show I saw it on, but, that's what, you reminded me of, and so there's another episode that, kind of got brushed under the rug, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to ask for people to research the phrase tearing of the wrist.
Say that again.
And the last thing I want to throw out, the tearing of the wrist.
Spell that last word.
Like the wrist of the arm.
WRIST? Tearing
Yeah,
of the
because
wrist.
that's a name that's come up in the Indrid Cold story. Somebody was using that alias, Terry Wrist, and I'm thinking that maybe that's. And I recently saw a reference to that being a Masonic phrase, but then I couldn't find the reference again. So I'm wondering if anybody knows if that's a Masonic phrase of some kind.
The phrase would be tearing, right? Verb.
Yeah. Can Terry be switched into tearing? Because that's what I remember it saying, that it was the tearing of the wrist was some sort of Masonic, it's like the killing of the king or whatever.
Right. All right.
It'd be nice to know.
Okay.
As we hone in on just who was Indrid Cold.
Mm-hmm. All right. You ready to call it a day?
Yeah.
All right. Stay with me for a second, if you would. We've been talking with Andrew Colvin, continuing where we left off. And who knows where this is going to go. But you've been listening to Think or Be Eaten, and we will continue with Andrew in the very near future. Thanks for listening, folks.
looking in, feeding fear, I'll take life, much remain in my thoughts, silent owl, hiding thoughts, both around in the box. In the box, hear the tick